Hey, Mr. P here. In this video, we're going to talk about the blood system, specifically heart and vessel anatomy. So we're not going to get really into how the heartbeat is controlled. We're not going to get to any of the EKG type stuff. We're not going to talk about really how the blood is pumped necessarily, but we are going to kind of get an overview or start with an overview of how the heart is structured, how the veins and blood vessels and arteries are structured to allow it to withstand the pressures associated with each of the vessels. We're going to finish off this particular lecture with a simple diagram of the blood flow through the heart so that we not only have an overview of how the heart is structured, but also how the blood is moved through the heart. In future videos, we'll dive into a little more depth on how the heartbeat is controlled specifically, and talk a little bit about what happens, or certain disorders, what happens if plaque and other types of substances get built up in the blood vessels, and how that impacts the way that the heart beats, and also how it can transport blood. So for this video, like I said, we're going to talk about heart and vessel anatomy. When we talk about the blood system, we have to obviously talk about blood, and a lot of people think that erythrocytes, or the red blood cells, are the primary part of blood, or the primary cell that blood is composed of. And while that is true to an extent, the volume is actually made up primarily of plasma, or at least the majority of the volume is plasma. The second majority would be made of the erythrocytes. So the erythrocytes are the red blood cells. Okay, those are the cells that are in charge of carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. They have an enzyme as kind of embedded or as part of that particular blood called hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin enzyme has an active site that is conducive to joining oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules, which holds on to them as they travel from lungs to body tissue, or from body tissue to lungs. So erythrocytes, those are the red blood cells. Those make up roughly 45% of the total blood volume. Kind of a fun fact, the reason that these blood cells, or the erythrocytes, are actually kind of concave like they are is because they are one of the only cells in the human body that lack a nucleus. And so they're kind of concave like that because the nucleus has been removed. And if you think about the way cells are structured, the nucleus is a pretty big void that would need to be filled. And if these cells, which are eukaryotic cells, lose their nucleus, then obviously the cell membrane has nowhere to go but pinch in to kind of fill that void. So that is designed to increase surface area and decrease volume, which is important because these cells are primarily in charge of oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. Okay, oxygen and carbon dioxide has to diffuse from tissue within the lungs or body, and the way that it diffuses is through the surface area. So we want cells that have a high surface area and low volume, which these erythrocytes are perfectly adapted to do. This buffy coat is made of leukocytes and platelets. Leukocytes are your white blood cells. Okay, leuko is the prefix that means white, while erythro is the prefix that means red. So these are your red cells. These are your white cells. The leukocytes are the white blood cells. We have future topics in IB biology that are specific to the immune response. So we're not going to talk about immune system or the cells responsible for the immune system in this cell, but I wanted to mention them because they are a part of the blood. More to come on that, but you have white blood cells that are monocytes, eosinophil, basophil, neutrophil, and lymphocytes. All of those will be discussed in future videos, but those are your white blood cells, and they do make up a portion of the blood volume. Less than 1%. Now, part of that 1%, or less than 1%, is made up of platelets as well. Platelets are in charge of blood clotting, while leukocytes are in charge of the immune response. So the white blood cells are going to be linked to your immune response, while the platelets are going to be responsible for blood clotting. Okay, we've talked about clotting in previous videos. We will talk about them in future videos as well, but just remember, platelets are the thing that is contained within blood that induces clotting, which is important because you're able to seal wounds and not bleed out. Plasma is the third component of blood in this order, okay? But plasma makes up the most volume, the biggest composition of the blood by volume would be plasma. And what is in plasma? It is not made of cells, okay? The erythrocyte layer, that would obviously be your red blood cells. Your buffy coat would be your leukocytes and your platelets. The plasma is kind of just the fluid, okay, that is housing all of the other cells. And in this fluid would be things like water. Okay, it is water-based. You would have proteins, nutrients, salts, metabolites, enzymes, and hormones. All of those things would be kind of within and dissolved in this blood fluid called plasma. Blood vessel anatomy. Okay, we're going to compare arteries versus veins. A lot of people might not know, or maybe you came into this lecture not knowing the difference between arteries and veins, but they are really, really different. It's always kind of a misconception that your veins and arteries are very similar because they carry blood, and while they do have the same function, okay, arteries and veins do have essentially the same function. They have a slightly different function, but they both carry blood, okay? They have that in common. Arteries are actually going to carry high blood pressure or high pressured blood, and they are going to carry that blood away from the heart. Okay, so when the heart pumps blood away from itself, it's going to send that blood into arteries, and within those arteries, the blood pressure is going to be very high because the blood behind it is going to be actively forced into those vessels. Okay, so the arteries are going to be very high pressure, and they're always carrying blood away from the heart. Because they carry high pressured blood, have to have very thick muscular walls and very small inner lumen. The diameter of the actual vessel itself, it has to be smaller, while the muscular layers have to be thicker, and that's because it has to withstand the high pressures associated with that particular vessel. They also have to have elastic fibers that are associated with those muscular layers, which are going to help it expand and contract to help keep the blood pressure constant. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But for the most part, right off the bat, arteries carry blood away from the heart. They are carrying blood that is highly pressurized. They have to have thick muscular walls, thin lumen, okay, or small interior diameter. And they have to have elastic fibers, which allows it to contract and expand in order to withstand the high pressures and not break. You don't want your arteries to break. That would cause massive internal bleeding, and that would be bad. Veins, on the other side, are going to be carrying low pressure blood, and they're going to be carrying that low pressure blood back to the heart. Because they are carrying low pressure blood, they have thinner walls, and they don't typically have the elastic fibers associated with the vessel because of the fact that they're carrying low pressured blood. Now, one adaptation that these vessels have that veins or that arteries don't have is the addition of these valves. Okay? Valves work by allowing fluids, in this case blood, to move through them only in one direction. The blood is able to flow very low pressurely, if that's a word, from the body tissues. Okay, so this is coming from body tissues through the vein, passing through these valves, which can't go backwards because once the blood moves through the valve can actually shut behind it, and it doesn't allow the blood to backtrack. The blood has nowhere to go but continually push through the veins and through the valves in the correct direction on their return back to the heart. Okay, veins, blood flow from tissues to heart. It's deoxygenated blood because it's returning from tissues back to the heart, which is carrying the carbon dioxide back to the heart in order for the heart to get rid of it through the lungs. And because it's low pressure, it needs to have valves. It needs to have larger interior diameters because of the low pressure. And it needs to have thin, kind of less muscular walls. Okay? If we focus on the arterial structure or the artery structure, there are some key things that we have to focus on. When we look at the diameter or the cross section of this particular vessel, you will see that the interior diameter, okay, the diameter here is actually very low or small. There are really thick muscular layers, okay, and those muscular layers are always associated with these elastic fibers. Okay, so if we kind of focus on this particular diagram, you have low or small interior lumen that helps to keep blood pressure high. Okay, if you're forcing a lot of volume through a really small tube, the pressure stays high, and you want the pressure to stay high because we want to have a good blood flow and be able to force that blood into every single one of the capillary beds so that every single one of the tissue cells can access the blood and access the nutrients and access the oxygen that each of the cells needs in order to survive. Okay? These muscular layers, which you can see, are made up of a few terms that you don't really need to know. It's basically longitudinal and circular muscle. Okay? And there are these elastic fibers or elastic membranes that kind of run between muscular layers, which allows it to have some flexibility when we are actively contracting and expanding these blood vessels with every heartbeat. Okay? There are high pressure pulses. It's called a heartbeat. Okay, when the heart beats and the heart physically contracts, it's going to force blood from the heart into the arteries, which is going to cause the volume of the blood in the artery to increase, which is going to cause the blood pressure to increase if these blood vessels were not allowed to expand a little bit. If we force a lot of blood into the artery and we allow the diameter of that lumen to increase slightly, it's actually going to kind of absorb some of the pressure, and it's going to hold the blood pressure steady between beats. You don't want the blood pressure, or you don't want your blood pressure to spike and then drop, spike, drop, spike, drop, spike, drop. With every heartbeat, you want your heart to beat and pump blood, but you want your blood pressure to stay steady. The way that your blood pressure remains steady is the vessels, specifically arteries, have the ability to contract and expand with every heartbeat to kind of maintain that constant blood pressure. Okay? So, how does a vein and artery differ? So you can see on a side-by-side comparison that the arteries, which is the blood vessel that takes blood from the heart to the capillary bed, which you can see back here. Okay, that's supposed to represent a capillary bed. Blood would be flowing through the artery into the capillary bed. It would be coming out into every single one of the tissue cells. The tissue cells would be using the oxygen that is carried by the blood in the artery. CO2 would be returning to the blood in the capillary bed, and then this blood would be returning this way through the valves associated with the veins. Now, when you look at them side by side, you'll see that the muscular wall of the artery is much thicker than the wall of the vein. In fact, it's probably twice as thick or 3 times as thick. The vein also has these valves, which allows blood to flow through them, but not backtrack, which is really important. We don't want our blood to kind of pool in any of our particular areas. You want the veins to move the blood in one direction through the valves and not let the blood return back to the tissues. Okay, so these thinner walls, less muscle, mean low pressure compared to arteries. Again, we've established that. Veins are going to be very low pressure compared to arteries, which are high pressure. You have valves in your veins, which is going to eliminate the risk of or prevent backflow of the blood to ensure the blood moves in the correct direction. And because you have thinner walls, you therefore have thicker interior lumens, which again remains low pressure because we're forcing the same amount of blood that goes through these arteries into these veins, and so that drops the pressure. So arteries are going to send blood to the capillary bed. Veins are going to return blood to the heart from the capillary bed. Capillary structure is specific to these capillary beds. So you'll see that in here, between all of these veins and arteries are these tissue cells. Now, the tissue cells require blood, but there isn't really like blood flow per se into the tissue cells. You have these capillary beds which contact all of your tissue cells. Blood flows from the heart into the artery. It's going to be sent through this network of capillaries, which is going to allow all of the substances possessed or contained within the blood to diffuse into all of those tissue cells through the tissue cell membrane. So oxygen is going to be diffused into the cell, CO2 is going to be diffused out of the cell, nutrients, minerals, ions, enzymes, proteins, nucleic acid, anything like that is going to diffuse out of the blood into the tissue cells. If it's a waste product, urea, stuff like that, it's going to be diffused out of the cell. Carbon dioxide, another example, going to be diffused out of the cell into the artery, or specifically into the capillary bed. And then the capillaries are going to all meet and converge into a vein in order to return that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay? There are a few different, in fact, 3 different types of capillaries. Okay? Capillaries, regardless of the type of capillary, is the smallest vessel in the human body. Okay? Capillaries are less than 10 micrometers in diameter. That's very, very, very small. They are much smaller than veins or arteries or venules or arterioles. And the reason they're so small is they have to penetrate and get to the level of every body tissue cell in order to diffuse nutrients and minerals and oxygen and CO2 into and out of the cell in order to keep the cells alive. Okay? It's all about the exchange of substances. Those blood vessels have to get to the level of the tissue cells in order to exchange those substances, and these capillaries allow them to do that. Now, the different types of capillaries are continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoid. A continuous capillary has a continuous endothelial lining. Okay? This endothelial layer or endothelial lining is a single cell thick kind of skin layer, but it's continuous. Okay? There aren't any pores, there aren't any openings, there are continuous cells that can completely contact each other, and it creates this continuous capillary structure. Okay? There are very tight junctions between their endothelial cells, which eliminates the ability to move larger substances through this layer. The only things that can really move through them are really small molecules like ions. Okay? This type of capillary is actually or generally found throughout the nervous system, like in the brain, and makes up the blood-brain barrier, which is really important because in the nervous system case, okay, or within the nervous system, as you'll find out in later videos, the nervous system really needs to have ions in order to contract or send these electrical impulses. Okay, and more on that to come. I don't want to kind of beat that right now, but these continuous capillary structures allow small ions to pass. Now, in comparison, these fenestrated capillaries are continuous. Okay, they have all of the tight junctions that the continuous capillaries have, but you'll see that they have these pores present that these continuous capillaries do not have. So they have small openings in their endothelium layer. They're known as fenestra or fenestrae. They kind of make this membrane more permeable. Okay, and these are generally found in tissues where large amounts of molecular exchange occurs, like kidneys. What are your kidneys for? Your kidneys filter your blood and remove all of the urine or urea in order for excretion. You have to have large amounts of filtration and large amounts of nutrient and urea and waste products that diffuse freely from your blood system into the kidneys. It requires a special type of capillary in this case because structure dictates function. this type of capillary is going to be much better at quickly allowing waste products to filter through in comparison to a continuous, which is only going to allow ions to pass through. The last one is sinusoid. Sinusoid is the kind of most fenestrated, meaning it has the biggest openings. It is going to be generally found in the liver, specifically between hepatocytes, which are liver cells, and the sinusoids of the spleen. These are all about the removal of large substances like whole cells, okay? Microorganisms, whole cells, red blood cells, whole cells. The ability of your body to remove whole cells requires large openings, and the sinusoid capillaries allow that to happen, okay? Just again, structure dictates function. This type of capillary is going to allow very large substances to move through and be filtered out of the blood. This is going to be a little less filter, but still require a large amount of substances to move through. And then this one is obviously the least amount of material movement. But all of them have a role, and all of them are really important. It's just a structure dictates function kind of example. Okay, surface area to volume ratio is very high. The reason these have very small interior lumen and a lot of exterior surface area is because in every single case, surface area to volume ratio is very high. Now, one of the skills associated with this particular topic is we have to understand vessel structure and be able to distinguish arteries from veins from capillaries within these electron micrographs or light micrographs, okay? So when you look at this, you should be able to see that there is a very apparent difference between, let's say, this vessel and this vessel. Most noticeably in the wall thickness, okay? It doesn't matter if this one, which is maybe even bigger than this one, but has a very small muscular layer. So if we focus on kind of identifying which ones of these belong to which category, this is no doubt a artery, okay? It has a very thick muscular wall, it has a very thin interior lumen, where in comparison, this is a vein, this is a vein, and this is a vein, okay? One thing to also point out is arteries, because of the fact that they're very high pressure and you have high pressures exerted out from the lumen in all directions, arteries are typically always going to be very circular and very kind of uniform in their circularity, whereas veins can be circular, but veins can also take on this very weird kind of random shape, and that's because there's very low pressure that's being exerted, and because they have very thin walls, they kind of flex and move around other tissue layers and other tissue and in and around muscles and stuff like that. So you have tissues that are kind of pushing in on the veins, and you have very low pressure pushing out, and that just creates a situation where the veins are not uniform in their appearance. In the picture on the right, obviously this is an artery. You can tell very muscular or very thick muscular layer, as well as a very thin interior lumen. You also have a vein on this side, which again is not uniform in its appearance and also has a very thin muscular layer. Okay? Alright, that's the end of this video. If you have any questions, bring them to class. In the next video, we'll get into how the blood actually circulates through the heart. We'll kind of label the diagram of the heart. We'll follow the path of the blood through the heart. That's coming soon. See ya.